Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 43 today. We're going to be doing the second part of what we started last week, and that theme is Catholicism in the Face of Modernity. So we'll pick back up by looking at Pius X. The Pope who succeeded Leo was Pius X. His policy was much more conservative than Leo's and drew its inspiration from Pius IX. So Leo is sandwiched between a couple of Piuses. We're going to have a lot of Piuses this round. But if you want to go back and look at what Leo did, you can listen to last week's episode. But the point is that we're going to be moving towards more of a conservative policy back to the way things were with Pius IX in the pontificate of Pius X. The result was a growing gulf between mainstream modern thought and society on the one hand and Catholicism on the other. So even more Catholic Church and Catholic policy from the upper echelons of leadership is going to continue to this movement away from modern thinking and ideas, whereas Protestantism did the opposite. They kind of tried to move towards more of the modern thinking and tried to incorporate it even into theology, study of the scriptures, going back and looking at the background of scripture. So going to be two groups. The two major sections of Western Christianity are going to be moving in opposite directions for a while. Following the Pope's instructions, the Holy Office, the Old Inquisition, issued a decree condemning those who had applied the new methods of research to Scripture or to theological matters. The group is called the Holy Office now, but they're really the Old Inquisition movement. If there's a lot of baggage that goes with that word, the Inquisition, but it has a background that's interesting. That's back in season 1. I don't know what episode off the top of my head, but you can go back and look for it and kind of brush up on what the Inquisition did and what it was about. But this is what is left of it. What exists at this time is called the Holy Office. And under the Pope's direction, they have condemned those who are trying to apply new methods, modern methods of research to scripture or to theological matters. So that's going to create a wedge we'll see going forward. These were so-called modernists, of whom the most famous were the Frenchman A.F. Loisy, the Englishman George Terrell, and the German Hermann Schell. So these guys are very influential. They are modern thinkers trying to apply some modern ideas to study of scripture, even looking at theological matters, and they're going to be rejected by the Catholic Church as a result. Shortly thereafter, Pius X confirmed the action of the Holy Office. So, of course, he confirmed it. He's the one who ordered it, but that made it official. The net result was that many of the modernists left the church, while greater numbers of Catholics decided to remain in the church but pay little attention to the pontifical directives. So in a period of time where the Pope is trying to gain more power in the church, he's lost political power. He's trying to gain more power in the church. He's actually put himself in a position where people are they're not going to listen to him as much because he's moved completely away from modern thinking, and the people that were used to these new ways of thinking about things are not going to accept that. So in his efforts to try to make a power play, he's actually going to do the opposite in a way. And people are going to say, well, I'll stay in the Catholic Church, but I'm just not going to pay any attention to what this Pope is saying about this stuff. World War I had just broken out when Pius X died and was succeeded by Benedict XV. So that's a great time to jump in as leader right as World War I's breaking out, but he did. So Benedict's in charge. He was determined to continue the policies of Pius X, who had made him a bishop. So he was very close to Pius X. He's going to just carry right on along with his policies. He continued the trend of the last three popes in insisting on his right to rule the papal states. So this is going to go on for at least through his reign. We'll see. It's going to come to a head pretty soon. But he's going to be another one that's going to just insist that the popes have the right to rule this area, but they don't have any control over it, and they're never getting it back again. So he's going to continue that trend. Though he spent most of World War I pursuing peace, by the time peace came and the League of Nations was established, he was not in a position to influence events in any decisive way. In general, he was perceived as more open than Pius X, but not a very effective pope. So in a time when the world really needed effective leadership and could have used someone to stand up and make a stand during the war. Maybe not as much as what we're going to see in World War II, but still, you got the world at war, basically, and at least the Western world. And you need a strong leadership for the church. He really provided that. So he wasn't very effective at that period of time. And kind of that was an opportunity that passed up the Catholic churches because of leadership in place wasn't able to answer the call. Pius XI succeeded Benedict XV, so we got another Pius now. Pius XI was a scholar and an able administrator, so he's going to do some things a little bit better than Benedict did, but he's going to have, of course, some shortcomings as well. He was also acutely aware of the increasing importance of the non-European world. He did all within his power to encourage missionary work and to help churches already established in missionary areas to attain maturity. So this is one of the biggest things that's going to come through the reign of Pius XI and also Pius XII. They're going to put a lot of work into building up the Catholic Church in areas outside of Europe. They notice that there's a big need for this. They see the church is increasing outside of the European world, and they don't want to lose the opportunity to strengthen that. So they did a really good thing there. And Pius XII, we'll see some things about him coming up that he even had some people in the West not happy with him of how much encouragement he gave to areas outside of the Western world. But these two guys did a lot to help advance the church in those areas and also to help the people in those areas to have some control. And at a time where colonization is going on, and in a lot of ways, the native population in many of these places didn't have any control, they do get some place in their own society in the church. So that's a positive thing that these two guys did. They didn't do everything right, but that's a good thing they did. During his time as Pope, the number of Catholic missionaries doubled, and it was he who consecrated the first Chinese bishops. So just really making a big push towards the international movement of the church. In contrast to most of the popes of this period, Pius XI was very interested in simple acts of piety and devotion. So he was a man who really did believe in the acts of devotion, acts of piety. He recognized that in the laity and also in the clergy. And so another positive thing about him as well. He was very interested in increasing the activity of the laity. In his first encyclical, he set the goals and rules for Catholic Action, the most important Catholic lay organization of the first half of the century. So he put a lot of time and work and effort into setting up the laity to be actively involved in the church. So again, we look at these guys and you can see a lot of failings, a lot of things they missed out on, but they do good things too. And that's another good one that he did. While Pius XI was very concerned about the dangers of communism, he did not manifest the same concern over fascism. So what we're going to see during this period of time is there's a great fear in the Catholic Church of communism. And the reason for that is that communism very plainly was outspoken against religion. Any communist country that came into play definitely did not accept the church and tried to crush the church. Whereas the fascist regimes may not necessarily have done that overtly. And so they felt like they had at least, kind of that deal, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they don't love fascists, but they're also against communists. So, I don't like both groups, but I don't like communists more. And so I'll kind of let fascism slide a little bit because I may be able to work with them. Not a good, that's not a good thing. Don't get me wrong, but it was kind of one of those things they, thought they had to have. If communism is the worst thing, then I'll work with whoever can help me fight communism, and that's the way they felt. Since Italian fascism in the early stages of its development favored Catholicism, the Pope was quite content to work with it. So again, if you're going to help me out, if we're going to work together, then, you may not love everything you're doing, but you're better than maybe the alternative. So I'm going to work with you. In 1929, his representative signed an agreement with Mussolini that finally resolved the issue of Italian sovereignty over Rome. So finally, this issue that had already been settled years ago, the Catholic Church had no more control over those areas that they once controlled. They hadn't since the time that it was taken from them. but they wouldn't acknowledge it. They would not come out and say, you're right. We know we don't have this. We acknowledge the Italian kingdom, state, whatever. And we're not going to even claim that we have it anymore. Well, that didn't happen until 1929, and finally that fight's over with, and they made an agreement. Italy acknowledged the existence of a sovereign state, Vatican City, and granted the papacy sovereignty over it, as well as financial compensation for the loss of other territories. They weren't going to get a very good deal at this point because they had no leverage, so this was the best deal they were going to get, and the Pope took it. So they get Vatican City, and they're going to get some financial compensation for what they lost. In return, Pius recognized the Kingdom of Italy as a legitimate state with Rome as its capital. So finally, officially, a pope goes on record and says, yes, I recognize that we don't have control of this territory anymore. The Kingdom of Italy is a real thing. They are legitimate. They have it. And Rome is its capital. And we just have our Vatican City in our area. So that's finally settled for all time. It was already settled in reality, but finally it's been acknowledged by a pope. Eventually, Pius XI clashed with Italian fascism, and he repeatedly condemned Hitler and Nazism in the early stages of their rise to power. Early on, the Pope was very heavily against the Nazi regime, but what we're going to see is that's not going to last. Now, the Italian fascists, on the other hand, as long as they were willing to work with him, he was not going to come out against them, but that changed, which it always does with these groups. They may come in smiling and, you know, putting their hand out to you and all that, but when the time comes that they don't need you anymore, they're power hungry, they're going to take you out. And unfortunately, a lot of people fall for that. The Pope did, but he eventually recognizes that that group's no good. And early on, he recognized that Hitler and the Nazi regime was not good, but again, that doesn't last. Later, however, he weakened his stance against the Nazi regime, and he did support Franco's brand of fascism in Spain. Again, a lot of this is going to have to do with trying to fight communism. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I'll just keep saying that. It's a true thing. People do work that way. If you even look at World War II, you see that all of these powers that were democratic in nature were willing to work with Russia, who was communist in nature, a government that was not on the same page at all, it was the very opposite, but they had a common enemy. And so they were allies in the war, but probably allies for the last time up in, you know, to our own day and time. And that is just another example of the fact that you will overlook certain issues if you have a common enemy. And we see that with the Catholic Church here, not trying to excuse not taking a stronger stance, which they should have, but at least you do kind of see there's a reason that they did it. It may not have been a good reason. It may not have been justifiable, but they did have a reason. And their reason was they saw communism as the biggest threat to Christianity. And so anything to fight communism, they were willing to do to a point. And we'll see where that point comes in. But at this point, they're saying they're kind of willing to go along with the group that maybe will help them with combating communism. In Germany, fear of liberalism and communism inclined many Catholics toward rising Nazism. In 1933, Catholic opposition to Hitler collapsed, and the political party led by Prelate Ludwig Kass gave Hitler the necessary majority to take control of the government. We see this playing out in Germany. Again, their fear of the modern liberalism, which kind of talked about this last week, but remember, progressive thinking and liberal thinking is different at different times. So in this period of time, this is moving towards more democratic type governments. It's not things that we would consider today to be liberal ideas. But at their time, it was a very liberal idea. It was a very progressive idea. It was moving away from monarchs and empires and all of that type of thing, kings and whatnot, to the people ruling themselves. So that's a very progressive thought at the time. And in Germany, they didn't want that. They wanted to get away from it. It's the same thing with the Catholic Church. And then at least the Catholics in Germany, maybe not everybody in Germany. And then communism, of course, is their common enemy. So the Catholics in Germany don't take a stand against the Nazis because they see them again as maybe they're not the best choice, but at least these modern ideas, and they're not for communism. So we can kind of work with them. And as a result, they took away one of the big oppositions to Hitler taking power, and he was able to do that. So, not obviously not the only factor, of course, but they did provide some resistance to Hitler that eventually went away. In Rome, Pius XI felt that the time had come to reach an agreement with Hitler. Within a few months, a concord was signed, which was viewed in international circles as the Vatican's qualified approval of the Nazi regime. So, not a great day for them in the Catholic Church. That not a shining example of standing up against evil. But again, their thinking on this is not, I don't love Hitler, but I don't want communism. So anything that's going to help fight communism, we're just going to have to fight together. And that was the way they thought. But of course, eventually they realized they'd made a huge mistake. And by the way, they're not the only ones who did that. There were a lot of powers that early on accepted Hitler until he started going crazy and trying to take over everybody. Then they stood up. But it wasn't like this moral stance. It was a self-preservation stance. So let's not get too down on the Catholic Church or anybody else, and realize that many nations of the world didn't make a stand. And when they did, the stand more was about their own benefit rather than actually fighting these evil people, which eventually they came to realize they were evil. And even some things they doubted could be true or didn't want to be true, found out that they were true. But it wasn't just like a completely moral war. It's more of a, if we don't do something now, then we're the next ones in line, and we got to fight for survival. So again, not trying to excuse anything, not trying to say anybody was justified in doing what they did, but also don't want to paint them as the only ones to make these bad decisions. And they certainly were not. Eventually, the Pope realized the dangers of Nazism, so he woke up to it. In 1937, he issued encyclicals, one against Nazism and one against communism. So he lumps them in, the Nazis and the communists together, and realizes, well, the enemy of my enemy is not my friend if he's really just as bad of an enemy as the first one. So he puts them together as both being unacceptable. And so good, he's still well ahead of the war and making this stance, and probably ahead of a lot of other world powers at the time. At this time, the Pope also prepared a strong speech condemning some of the actions of the fascist regime in Italy, but he did not yet break relations with it. He was still working on the speech when he died. So he prepared the speech, but he hadn't made the speech, and then he died. Cardinal Pacelli, who indicated his intention of continuing the policies of Pius XI, was elected his successor. He took on the name Pius XII. So we got another Pius. Pius XII was experienced in diplomatic affairs, had a slight penchant for nepotism, and a highly authoritarian and clerical view of the church. He was also a mystic who spent hours in prayer, a very hard worker whose aides often complained that he drove them too hard, and a man of personal magnetism who was respected by friend and foe alike. So with all of these people, with every human being that's ever walked on the face of this earth, you're going to have your positives and you're going to have your negatives. So while Pius XII definitely had some negative qualities, he definitely also had some very good positive qualities. And both of those things will be true of his reign. He's going to do some negative things, but he's also going to do some positive things. And he's kind of, in a way, going to pave the way forward for when the church really does make some serious reforms coming up. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Pius XII spent his early efforts in attempting unsuccessfully to prevent World War II. So again, another pope trying to stop the war doesn't succeed. Once war broke out, he followed a policy of neutrality, hoping that by remaining above the fray, he could serve as a mediator at the appropriate time. So again, doesn't end up looking so great because he doesn't make a stand. This neutrality came at the cost of silence in the face of Nazi atrocities against the Jews. So the stories of what were happening to the Jewish people in Germany is starting to come out now. And there's going to be a push to come out against those things, but the Pope doesn't do that. He's trying to stay in because he doesn't know who's going to win the war. And if there does come an end to the war, he wants to have a voice in helping to kind of set things up the way they'll be going forward. And in order to do that, he doesn't feel like he can take a side. He'll just stay neutral. It didn't work out for him. That policy that he had of silence, he was severely criticized, and deservedly so, by not making a stance there. But again, there's always reasons behind why people do these things, and that was his reason. He thought he was putting himself in a better position to have a voice, and in actuality, he put himself in a worse position. After the war, the Pope's international policy was primarily directed at the threat of communism, so back to what they were mostly concerned about. In 1949, he decreed automatic excommunication for any who supported the communists in whatever country. So what they see after World War II, we know this, is there's going to be a spread of communism throughout Eastern Europe and into Asia. And the Pope sees this and he's not pleased, and he's going to take a hard stance. And automatically he says a person is excommunicated, no questions asked, if they support communists. Doesn't matter what country it is. It doesn't even matter if your country is communist. If you support them, you're excommunicated from the church, period. This was the time of the great imperialistic expansion of Russia, whose orbit of influence included most of Eastern Europe. So they're going to push through Eastern Europe, but they're not going to stop there. China had also become communist, and at the time it seemed that the Catholic Church in that country, as well as all other churches, had been completely crushed. Now, we know they weren't completely crushed. The underground church continued to exist, but from the outside looking in, it looked like communists had pretty much wiped the church out in those countries. Against this threat, and also hoping to avert future wars, Pius XII joined the voices calling for a unified Europe. In 1953, he signed a concordat with Franco's fascist regime in Spain. So once again, the Pope's going to get back together with a fascist group. Not a great look, but why does that happen? He had several reasons for this. The increase of communists in the government of Spain caused some concern. So there were starting to be a lot of communist thinking people in the Spanish government. So right off the bat, that's going to set off the red flags. Oh, we got to do something about this. So who's going to help me fight it? Following the Civil War, Franco was in firm control of the nation, and his staunchest allies were the most conservative among the Catholic clergy because they were concerned about the communists. Therefore, in a world in which more and more governments were turning against the church, the Vatican welcomed Franco and his regime because they were on the church's side, at least for a while. So he's gonna welcome him in. We don't have a whole lot of people liking us right now, but you like us, so we're not gonna burn that little bridge. We need it, and so they stay in good standing with Franco and fascism in Spain at that time. Pius XII tended to centralize the government of the church, depriving the national episcopates of much of their initiative. But above all, he was extremely suspicious of innovations in the field of theology, and that's going to be the case through his reign. In 1950, the Pope issued a bull that reiterated earlier warnings against innovations in theology. Some of the most creative Catholic theologians of the time were silenced, among them several whose writings laid the groundwork for the Second Vatican Council. Now, look, I'm not necessarily always against somebody being against innovations in theology. We have had some bad innovations in theology through the years. There's a lot of theology that doesn't need to be innovated. Maybe there are some better ways of presenting it or fine-tuning it. Yes, okay. But flat out trying to innovate some things, not necessarily always a good thing. So it just depends on a case-by-case basis. But the Pope himself, he wasn't taking it on a case-by-case basis. He was just saying anything that deviated from the traditions of the past was no good. And so he made a stand on that. And he silenced people that are going to eventually, their writings are going to influence the reform that's coming with the Second Vatican Council, but that's not going to be influential in their own day to the extent that they could have been because the Pope came out against them. In France, some Catholic leaders sought to penetrate the labor movement through worker priests who took employment as common laborers. So the Catholic Church wanted to get in on the labor movement and have its influence over it. And so the way they decided to do that is they would set priests up to go and become a worker. And most of the time they didn't identify themselves as priests. They just came in as a common laborer like everyone else. And they were going to influence things from the inside out. Well, it was a good idea on paper, but it didn't exactly work. Although the movement was criticized by the more conservative elements in French Catholicism, at first it had the support of the Vatican. But that changed. When several priests became leaders in the labor movement and took a stance against capital, the Pope withdrew his support. So they're starting to move more towards the socialism, communist ideas. And the Pope is like, whoa, we're not influencing them from the inside out. They're influencing us from the inside out. So he stopped all that. He ordered all worker priests to withdraw from the labor force, and he closed the seminary where most of them were being trained. So he put a stop to that movement altogether. However, some of the policies of Pius XII did pave the way for the great changes that took place during the next pontificate, and that's going to be the Second Vatican Council that's coming. He encouraged the use of modern methods of biblical study. So while he wasn't crazy about innovations in theology, he did support people studying the Bible with some of the more modern methods. So that's very positive. The biblical studies that took place under this policy would later contribute to the renewal of the church. So a very positive step he took there. The reform of the liturgy, which was one of the earliest actions of the Second Vatican Council, was encouraged by him, albeit with great caution. So he kind of put the idea out there of reforming the liturgy. It didn't happen under him, but he laid the groundwork for it to be acceptable. And so, again, that's a positive thing. But above all, he led the way to the internationalization of the church that eventually made possible the Second Vatican Council. So this movement that Pius XI started and really put a lot of effort into, he continued it on. And he's gonna take it and go even further with it in encouraging the progression of the Catholic Church in the native populations of the areas that it expanded to, and to see it expand even further. Pius XII continued the policy of strengthening churches outside of Europe. He also encouraged the emancipation of colonies to the point that he was criticized as being an enemy of Europe. So he sees what's coming, and he sees that eventually these colonies are going to rule themselves, and European influence will be taken out. And he doesn't want to be one of the European influences that gets taken out. So he sides with the native people. It's very smart, but it was also the right thing to do. And that's going to create inroads into these nations so that when others leave, the Catholic Church will still have a presence there. And those native populations will have some say in a time when they didn't have very much say in their own culture, their own way of life, their own way to be ruled. The Catholic Church gives them a place where they have a voice. And that, again, is a very big thing. You can only laud Pius XII for that and admire him for doing that at a time where people were actually criticizing him for it. While insisting on his universal control of the church, he encouraged the formation of indigenous churches under the leadership of native bishops, so he continued to push that idea. The policy led to the formation of the Conference of Latin American Bishops, the first such official organization on an international and regional basis. So just doing things in a very good way, doing things the right way, is going to pay off in the future. And that's seeds that are planted are going to have a harvest of great fruit. And you can look at Pius XII as, again, can you look at things he did that were bad? Yes, you can. But you have to give him credit for this one. Thus, though he was a conservative pope, he set in motion the machinery that would eventually lead to the Second Vatican Council and the Reformation it espoused. So he wouldn't have been for that necessarily, but he sets the groundwork for it to happen. And again, he gets credit for that. In conclusion, after the American and French Revolution, and in the midst of a radically changing context, all Christian churches had to face new political, economic, social, and intellectual circumstances. So this is kind of what we've been talking about over the last 3 weeks now. We've talked about it with the Protestant church, and then over the last 2 weeks, we've talked about it, these modern ideas in the Catholic Church. In general, Protestantism sought the means to take those new realities into account, but Catholicism took the opposite tack. It actually went against them. As a result, by the time of World War I, Protestants and Catholics were as far apart as they had been at any previous time. So that's saying a lot when you think about the fact that the Protestants split away from the Catholic Church in a split that there was the threat of war, and there actually were wars, and a lot of people died. So that was a very contentious time. Things had somewhat settled down a little bit, but now with the Protestants kind of going more towards modern thinking and the Catholics moving away from it, there's a gulf between them that's as big as there's ever been. It would not be until the second half of the 20th century with the Second Vatican Council that official Roman Catholicism would review its exceedingly negative view of modernity. So that's where things are going to change. We'll pick up with that later on in our study as we go through this, but that's all we're going to have time for today. Thanks once again for taking time with me. Hope that you have a great rest of your week. Looking forward to being with you again next week. And in the meantime, God bless.